Alberta and Canada, of course. My name is Sarah. I'm from the Center for Global Education. I want to welcome you all today, but we're joining from across Canada. I even think we have a school from Brazil joining us today. We might have our friends from Bangladesh log in. They were saying they were hopeful to come. So I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we join on today, from Edmonton, from coast to coast to coast. While we're meeting on a virtual platform, I'd like to take a moment to think and acknowledge the importance of the lands in which we all call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibly improving relationships between nations and improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. And from coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. And now together, we as Canadians must do more than just talk about reconciliation. And it's really the whole point of today's conversation is, what does that mean? What does it look like? We have to learn, how do we practice it? How do we do this in our everyday lives? How do we work within ourselves, within our families, within our schools, within maybe our workplaces or our faith communities, to really to remain committed to this ongoing work, establishing and maintaining and understanding respectful relationships and what those look like, and how we honor and really embed those in our characters. So holding this line, we need to hold this land acknowledgement that we've just given, or that I've just given, but really as a thought for framing the whole conversation today. This isn't just something that should be routine that we do at the start of meetings. It should be really like, how does this frame the conversation that we're having? How does this make me think deeply and differently about my day going forward, and listening to our guest speaker and all those? How are we bringing in Indigenous presence and voices to our institutions, but also to our daily lives? And how are we fostering mutual respect and reconciliation? So not just how are we acknowledging, or how are we accepting, or how are we but how are we actually fostering it? What are we actively doing ourselves? And I mean, Charlene Barehead, who is the director of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, which is, and the Canadian Geographic is a part of that. She has this really famous quote that I love to think about. It's like, life can be understood by looking backward, but we must live together looking forward if reconciliation between our peoples is to happen. I just think that's such a great thought and way of framing conversations. Anyways, I could chat. Oh, I do also want to acknowledge our friends at CCUNESCO who are partnering today. So our friend Isabel might join us later from the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, and I'll invite her at that time to say a few words. But CCUNESCO helps Canadians share knowledge locally and globally in order to create better societies and build peace in the minds of all people. So the Commission facilitates cooperation events in the fields of education and science and culture and communication, and just to address some of the most complex challenges facing our world. And so we love the UNESCO Commission. They've been working alongside us in many respects, and we've done events this year on literacy, we've done events on Black Lives Matters, and it's really, how do we engage in these topics in meaningful ways? And now we have reconciliation, and our friends are here from Canadian Geographic, and I know many teachers received the resources ahead of this event, and I'm hoping they had a chance to sort of introduce them to the students, or at least have a chance to look at their brilliant website, because Dominique, it is fantastic. I loved the interactive map, and I really loved the way it was based in storytelling. And I mean, I'll go with that in a bit, but I'll say first that Dominique is the education program coordinator at the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. She has a bachelor degree in education in the primary junior division from Ottawa University, and she's worked in elementary classrooms and museums in Ottawa, Ontario, hoping to encourage curiosity and the love of learning in students of all ages. She's passionate about inclusive education and seeks to encourage conversations about sustainability and global citizenship in her teaching. Yes, global citizenship, that's so us. We're all of it. So Dominique, thank you so much for joining us today for this important conversation. It's unfortunate that our YouTube link isn't going, because I see that there are lots of people there who are waiting still for something to maybe happen, but we will get this recording to them later. But Dominique, welcome. And yes, I'd love to help supplement anything I missed on your introduction.
Thank you so much, Sarah. No, I think that you covered it all. I'm so thrilled that you were able to look over the Paths to Reconciliation resource, and that you loved it. It is a really wonderful resource, and I'm so happy that we'll be able to chat about it and explore it a bit more today. So thank you so much for welcoming, for that lovely welcome, and for having me here today.
Wonderful. Now, what I know you're going to tell us more about this, but I wanted to maybe start with that, with just your initial impressions on that famous Charlene Barrhead quote, where she's really talking about how you know, like that fostering that active reconciliation, where we looking backwards is and feeling, maybe oftentimes people talk about feeling guilty, and how that it's not a productive place, but that we really need to work forward together to make change. How do you, I mean, that's your everyday life, working on this path to reconciliation, and how do you fit in all that personally, and what does it make you think about the work that you do?
Yeah, I think you know, it's sometimes the most important topics that we learn about are the ones that make us the most uncomfortable, but they're still very critical and important to learn about throughout our lives. And there's the learning really never stops. You know, we're learning up until you know, into our adulthood and everything. So I think that there's so much to learn out there, so much for us to kind of acknowledge in ourselves, and then to really ask the question, you know, what can I do, and how can I do better, and how can I make that change? And so I think it's really about looking at your place in the world, and how you can help make, you know, whether it's your community or country or nation or, you know, world better. And I hope that the resources that we create and provide to teachers kind of help show students how they fit in, you know, how they can fit into the world, and how they can how they can become global citizens.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Well, I'm going to pass the floor over to you, and you can guide us through the wonderfulness that you want to share today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. And for those of us who are going to be watching the recording later, good morning or good afternoon, whenever you're watching us. Thank you very much for joining me today. As Sarah mentioned, my name is Dominique Patnaik. I work at the Royal Canadian Geographical Society in their education department, which is known as Canadian Geographic Education. You might have heard of us through our magazine, Canadian Geographic Magazine. So as Sarah mentioned, my job is to help create free resources that teachers, students, and families can use to help learn about Canadian geography, history, heritage, and much more. Before we begin, I would also like to acknowledge that I am in Ottawa, and Canadian Geographic Education offices are located on the unceded territory of the Algonquin peoples, who have been the guardians of and in relationship with these lands for thousands of years. I further acknowledge and recognize that my work at Canadian Geographic Education reaches across distinct First Nations, Métis homelands, and Inuit Nunangat, and for this I am grateful. I'd also like to let everyone know that today we'll be talking about a sensitive topic, residential schools. So it may be disturbing to some people. If you feel overwhelmed or uncomfortable, I encourage you to take a break, reach out to your teacher to let them know. And I want to let everybody know that this is a safe space to respectfully communicate and have dialogue on these sensitive yet critical topics. There's also going to be time for questions at the end, but if you do have questions, feel free to pop them up in the chat during the presentation. That is no problem. And Sarah, I will just share my screen now. I think I should be able to do that.
Fingers crossed that Zoom doesn't get us again. Oh no, it's playing along.
It is? Okay, excellent. I never know what is going to happen with Zoom. Now, let me just see here. There we go. Okay, just gonna pop open the chat here just so I can see if anybody has any questions. All right, so as I mentioned, I'm from CanGeo Education. Our website is cangeoeducation.ca, where you'll find all of our resources. We offer many different student-friendly Indigenous resources to explore. Today, as I kind of hinted at the beginning, we're just going to focus on the Paths to Reconciliation project we've developed. All of our Indigenous resources have been created by Indigenous educators. We work with them to make sure all of our resources are authentic and representative to the stories that are being told. We also come at this recognizing that we haven't covered everything. This is merely just the beginning of what we can do. You know, kind of to tie into Charlene's quote there, we feel it's a step in the right direction, and we definitely have work to do. And so residential schools, but before we kind of get into talking about the Paths to Reconciliation project, I'd like to just quickly touch on residential schools. Now, I'm wondering, I don't know if you'll have this option, so maybe I'll say in the chat, I don't know if people have the emoji option right now while I'm screen sharing, but I'll say if you've, by using a Y for yes or an N for no in the chat, let me know if you've heard about the residential school system in Canada and if you know why it was created. So if you do have the emoji option, you can also do a thumbs up emoji or a surprised face emoji.
There's lots of yeses coming through.
Yes, yeah. Okay.
People are feeling confident.
Okay, yes, I see that. All right, so I will just quickly say, so the Canadian federal residential school system began around 1883. But the origins of the residential school system can be traced to as early as the 1830s. And even prior to this, churches had built schools specifically for Indigenous children since the mid-1600s. The Canadian government and churches built the residential school system as a means to handle what they called the perceived threat and barrier posed by Indigenous peoples to the ongoing construction of Canada, which at that time was newly forming as a nation. The goal of the federal residential school system was to enforce the adoption of European traditions, languages, and lifestyles by First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children. They aimed to assimilate Indigenous children by taking them away from their families and forcibly eradicating their cultural identity. Today, we'll be talking about residential schools, but residential schools that were not recognized in the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, which I'll talk about later. So today we're going to explore the project and the resources of Paths to Reconciliation together. So CanGeo Education worked with the Orange Shirt Society and the Government of Canada to create this resource. It was created as part of a larger initiative to raise awareness of residential schools in Canada and to also highlight the experiences of residential school students and their families. And another question I'd like to ask, and feel free to pop your answer in the chat. I'd like to ask you, and don't worry about getting this answer wrong because I got it wrong the first time I was asked. How many residential schools do you think operated in Canada? So any number that you think. How many residential schools operated in Canada? Okay, so I see 1,000 from somebody, over 200, more than 100, 27.
It's a big range of guesses.
It is, yeah, yeah.
Really appreciate you guys participating. It can be intimidating to put your thoughts out there. So this is amazing. I love it.
Yes, Sarah, I was just about to say that. It's so great to see people participating, and I agree. It can be intimidating, so I really appreciate it. And thank you all for your answers. In terms of why I asked that question was because one of the reasons that Paths to Reconciliation was created is because in 2006, something called the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement was reached. And this agreement has different parts to help address the legacy of the residential school system. So this is the opening page from the Paths to Reconciliation website. It says hundreds of Indian residential schools were never recognized in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement because they operated outside the timelines of the agreement or by provinces or other organizations. So I'll explain why that's important. So 130 schools were recognized in this Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, and this number grew to 139 after appeals. Now, why that's important is because students who attended these schools were eligible to apply for compensation. And as it turns out, this was only a fraction of the total numbers of schools that operated. So hundreds of residential schools were never recognized in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement because, as we saw before, they were operated outside the timelines of the agreement, or they were operated by provinces or other organizations. Paths to Reconciliation is a project with many different components, but the goal of this project is to share the survival stories of men and women who as children and teens attended the residential schools not recognized by the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, and to help raise awareness of these schools. The schools that have been identified to date, so that's really important, the ones that have been identified to date are plotted on this Paths to Reconciliation map. And what were these schools and why weren't they recognized in this settlement agreement? So these are the categories of schools based on the research that was done in the Paths to Reconciliation project. So again, these were the schools that were not recognized by the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. So there's hospital schools, post-Confederation schools, Métis schools, pre-Confederation schools, so before Canada was established as a country, Newfoundland schools, provincial and territorial schools, religious schools, and private schools. So again, I'd like to ask you to share your thoughts. Looking at this list, why do you think these schools were not included in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement? So again, you can post your answer in the chat. I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. But when you're looking at this list of schools, what do they have in common, do you think? What could set them apart from schools that were recognized? Why might a Newfoundland school not be recognized? And just a reminder that we welcome all answers and ideas.
I can imagine with so many different types of school that the answer is going to be quite complex, and there's not one right answer or one wrong answer here. That there's
Right.
so many factors that fed in that really, I can imagine that we're going to get a bunch of different answers that are all correct in some way.
Exactly. It's a very complicated, a complicated question and a complicated answer. So I really appreciate, and I'm seeing not funded or operated by the federal government, not funded by government. Newfoundland wasn't a part of Canada until 1960 something, not under the jurisdiction of the federal government. Thank you so much for your answers, everybody. And you are all absolutely on the right track. Some were disguised as a good thing, some not government run fully, Métis not recognized as Indigenous. Great answers, everybody. So the most claims, I'll say this, those are all very valid reasons, and reasons that were used as well to why some of these schools weren't included in the settlement agreement, as we'll discuss later. Most of the claims to be considered in the school agreement were rejected for one of the following reasons. So the school in question operated outside the timelines of the agreement. Students did not have to live away from their families at the school in question, and I think somebody kind of touched on that a little bit. And the school was run by the province or another organization. So again, somebody touched on that if they weren't run by the federal government, if they were run by a different organization or a province, they wouldn't be eligible to be considered in the agreement. And definitely the Newfoundland answer as well was right. Newfoundland, the schools in Newfoundland were established before Newfoundland was actually part of Canada, so they weren't considered eligible. But I think I'd bring this up later, there was an agreement reached. And the problem with these criteria is that they don't take into account students' experiences in the education system as a whole. It's this criteria, but we're not considering students' experiences in the education system. So now I'd like to give you just 5 minutes, or well, maybe make it a little bit less because of time. So a few minutes to explore the website. You can follow the instructions on the screen to discover a school near where you live. So I can show you how to get to the website. So if you just go to pathtoreconciliation.canadiangeographic.ca, and Sarah, maybe you can just pop that into the chat as well.
I was just gonna say, I'm gonna do that for everyone. I'm loading
and I'll just,
it here. So
perfect. And I'll just, can people see the Paths to Reconciliation website on my screen?
Yeah.
Like, am I sharing that?
yes, looks great.
Okay, so you're just gonna choose either English or French, whichever you prefer. You can click the little red button there to enter. And then you can find where you are on the map. So I'm in Ottawa, so I can go close to Ottawa. Oh, sorry, it's gonna be very slow because I'm on Zoom. Okay, so I'm close to Ottawa here. I'm going to click on one of the buttons and it'll show me the two residential schools listed here. So Alderville Residential School and Grape Island Residential School. So I can say, you can't see it because I think my map's a little bit blocked, but they're between Toronto and Kingston. If I want to see what category of school it was, I just click on the legend and it's color coordinated here. So the circle, if I choose Grape Island, the circle is yellow, so it's considered a pre-Confederation school. And then if I want to know approximately how long the school was in operation, and the top right here, there's number of years in operation. So I just compare the circle size. So comparing the circle size, it looks maybe about 10, it was in operation for about 10 years. And then another neat part is if I go to the three little lines in the top left-hand side, I can go to the timeline of residential school operations. And then I remembered that it was a pre-Confederation school. And I can see here Grape Island, and I can see what years it operated. So probably about maybe about 1828 to 1837 or 38, somewhere around there. So I can let you explore. So I'll pop up the instructions again, but just if you head onto the website, find a location, a residential school near you. You can jot down where it's located, approximately how long, what the name was, what category of school it is, and approximately how many years the school was in operation. And then you can, even if you'd like, you can go to the timeline and find out approximately when the school was operating.
Amazing. So we're going to give a couple minutes for that. Now, if you are at a school site and you aren't able to do that with your teacher, or if you're at home, I think you'll be able to link out and come back in. But if you would like us to lead you through one, you can also write yes in the chat, and I could pop you guys into a breakout room with Dominique, and maybe you guys could look at one. I mean, she just went through one as well, but we'll see. We certainly don't want anyone to miss out on exploring this. It's such a great
Of course, yeah. Or I can even, if there are a lot of people in classrooms, what I can do as well is if somebody wants to put a location of where they are, I can always explore that way as well. I can go to that location and show people where it is.
And if you're a teacher and you're with your class and you just want to mute you for a little bit of time, I'll pop in the chat when we're coming back together. Oh, we have Red Earth, Alberta.
Okay,
and
Red Earth, Alberta.
And there's also a question is if they can have a copy of the PowerPoint later so they can use this again to help students navigate. And then I'm
sure it will be no problem at all. I can share that with everybody. Let's see. Okay, so here we are. And what was sorry, I keep losing the chat. What was the first location?
Right. So we have Red Earth, which is quite small, and it's near Peace River, I think, or Slave Lake in Alberta. But we also have some of our friends from Bishop Strachan in Toronto, if that's a little easier for you to locate on the map. But maybe you can quickly do in
Yeah,
Alberta.
we'll go down to
and
Toronto
then-
first. But I'm always happy to explore new areas as well. Okay, so we have two here. We have Mountain Sanatorium and we have Weston Sanatorium. So we can see here, if we look at the two circles, if we go to Weston Sanatorium, again, maybe you can pop in the chat what type of school were actually, both of these were Mountain Sanatorium and Weston Sanatorium, if you look at the color codes here.
I think the name is a bit of a hint too.
Yes, yeah.
I know we often hear about these in shows.
Yes, yeah.
Hospital
Yeah.
schools,
Yeah,
it's rolling in.
schools. Yeah, so if we've got pink, we look up here, it is a hospital school. And if we look at how long how many years it was in operation for, I mean, I'm trying to just see, it looks like Weston Sanatorium was maybe about 10 years. And here we go, Weston Sanatorium was actually much lower, under 5 years, and Mountain Sanatorium was probably about maybe just under 10 years. And then let's go to the timeline. And if we go to hospital schools, oh, there's quite a few. Let's see here, Weston. Yeah, okay, so we have Weston there. So there's a bit of a question mark. So that might be one that they weren't able to find the exact dates of the operation. And I've already forgotten the other one, I apologize. It was Weston and Mountain, I think, right?
Mm-hmm. A couple below.
Oh, Mountain.
Near
yeah.
Hamilton.
So we see there, so probably, 1957 or so until about 1947 to about 1955 or so.
Awesome.
So that it's a really wonderful, I don't want to, I do recognize that we're a little bit tight on time, so I don't want to, there's other things that I want to show you, definitely. So I will move on to the next one, but I definitely recommend that you have some time to explore. There's many other aspects on that interactive website that I can show you after as well. And hopefully you're all seeing my PowerPoint again.
Yep, looks great.
So as I mentioned as well, there are survivor stories. There's another part of the Path to Reconciliation is survivor stories. So if we look at, oh, sorry. There we go. In the, once you click on the legend, you'll be able to click on the icon that says survivor stories. And again, for people, these stories are sometimes very hard to read and contain sensitive information. So just something to prepare for. But I just wanted to give a little background on these three survivors. The first one, Leah Idlout. She was 12 when she was taken to Palksaval Hospital from her family in Pond Inlet in 1951, and she didn't return home until she was 16 years old. The current argument for rejecting hospital schools like Palksaval is that Canada placed Indigenous people there primarily for the purposes of medical treatment, not education. When we think about, and I think somebody else had kind of said this in the chat when we're looking at reasons for rejection, sometimes the schools were considered good, like quote unquote good. But when we look at Leah's situation, we have to ask what other option was available to her apart from going to Palksaval and getting an education there. Like where else was she supposed to be able to get an education? Mike Durache, he was sent to Ile à la Crosse by his parents because that's what was expected and available at the time, especially for Catholics. Some Métis children attended this school only during the day. Others lived there until summer if they came from far away. Mike was able to live at the school during weekdays and go home for most weekends and holidays. And the current argument for excluding boarding schools like the one Mike attended is that students were not compelled to attend. And so while that might technically be true, we do ask a question that might come up is, again, what other choice did Métis parents like Mike's family have for their children? Because Métis children were not able to attend provincial schools. So that word compelled will come up later, and what that word compelled means. And Clara Clare is, she attended the All Hallows Yale School for Indian Girls in BC starting about 1889 at the age of 8, and she stayed for 13 years. And hers is an uncommon story because she actually indicates that she had a good experience. The current argument for why schools like Clara's were not included, despite her living there, is that she was not, again, compelled by physical or administrative force to attend. And also there are no remaining living survivors. So it's clear that Clara had no other school options available to her. It's also very likely, given the time, we're thinking 1889, that Clara's mother hoped that if she learned to read and speak English and live her life according to the expectations of the colonial society at the time, that she would have the best chance for survival and success in her life. And I just wanted to share some little snippets of the stories that we have on the website because I think they're so powerful. And I'll start with Clara Clare. So in a recent interview, Björky is Claire's great-granddaughter, says Claire's residential school experience was not of the kind you hear about where children were abused. My Nana was not abused the way Catholic kids were. They were treated far differently as far as I know. The nuns came over to teach them British colonialism, which is so different from the Catholic factor. That isn't what this school was like. The poor kids in the Catholic residential schools did not learn this stuff. These girls were learning to be refined. And according to historian Jean Barman, who has written about the school Claire attended, the Indigenous people's training was either for household occupation at home or for domestic service. Each annual prize day, the Indigenous girls were especially commended in such areas as bread making and laundry work. A former white pupil quoted in her work put it bluntly, "They were the servants, they did the work." Indigenous girls got up an hour earlier than their white counterparts to do the housework before the joint chapel service at 7:30 a.m. Students were then in classroom from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., though not all classes were taught to both groups. For example, white pupils learned music, Indigenous girls baked bread or made baskets. And then Mike Durache, most of us started school in grade 1 when we were 7 years old. Our parents were very reluctant to let us go to school any sooner. 99% of us spoke only Michif Cree or Michif Cree, so nobody spoke any English when they first went to school. It was very difficult. I mean, the school was good, you learned your ABCs, but the school is run by the Catholic Church, the diocese from the PA, and the nuns and the priest all spoke French. If you got caught speaking Cree, then you got disciplined. The first couple of times, you probably got a lecture and a good scolding, and beyond that, they would start giving you the strap. It was very strict Roman Catholic. Basically, the church ran the town. You went to church on Sundays. I was an altar boy from when I was little. So even in the residential school, I'd get up early in the morning, go to church and serve mass, and then go have breakfast and go to school. We didn't miss Easter, Christmas, all the special religious functions. We were always part of it. There was no excuse to miss. And then Leah, when we arrived in the hospital, I was received by a nurse. So sorry, just to remind you that Leah attended Palk-Saval, the hospital. I was received by a nurse dressed all in white from head to toe. First off, the nurse gave me a bath and washed my hair. Then she dressed me in fresh clothing, slacks that I had never worn before, a t-shirt with sideways stripes. It felt so good to have a bath after 3 months. And I will say here that as part of her story, she does travel by boat, and that's why she hasn't had a bath in 3 months, because she's had to travel so far to reach Palk-Saval. Then the nurse put me into a crib with the bars up. Everything about me was all in white. Even my crib was painted white with white sheets and a white pillowcase. I don't remember too much of anything that happened at that time, but I do remember that I hated being put into the crib with the bars up. I had never seen a crib before, and I thought it was only a thing found in hospitals. Once again, I felt so lonely and more lost than I had ever felt before. Being forced to stay in bed all day and all night was too much for me. At home, I had always been busy helping my mother and father in the house or playing freely outdoors whenever I wanted on the land that was peaceful and free. The only time I was allowed to get out of my crib and onto the floor was when I was served meals and when I had to go to the toilet very badly. Aside from that, I spent hours and hours each day and night just looking out the window, staring and wondering what was going to happen to me next. I felt so distant from my family. And so those are the 3 survivor stories that were that are highlighted on the Path to Reconciliation website, and you can explore them further on there. Their full stories, as well as photos and interviews and articles as well. So you can really kind of get into the stories behind these people and their experiences. And I will say, just looking at the time, I do want to kind of bring up a few questions that I think we can chat about now, but also these questions will also be really good for discussion afterwards, because some of them do take a little bit of time to kind of sit with. So the first question that I have is why, and again, post in the chat, or if you feel comfortable, you can unmute your microphone, but why is it so important to collect survivor stories? And why is it so important right now to collect survivor stories? And I know that this is a big question.
I was muted there, which was helping everyone. Oh, we have some, so we don't repeat history. And as people are to have firsthand evidence, to remember or learn from the past. Thanks so much for contributing all these. I know that personally, when I hear someone's story, it's that active empathy building, right? Like I can imagine how there's just so much more emotions and that tie. It's like we're wired in some ways for storytelling, right? Like that's a way that we can really communicate with each other through building ideas, and then we imagine places and people, and how then I think it's inherently you project yourself into that, and that becomes a vulnerability, right? You really open your own emotions up to the vulnerability of that trauma. And I think that it's different than just reading about straight history, right? Or watching a YouTube video about straight history, or, I mean, and the website is amazing, but it's those stories that really build the empathy in my mind. And we have the need to ensure that this never happens again. And then as a mirror to the past of history, and then Greystone Heights is added, so we know that people went through and we don't repeat history. These are some great comments. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, no, they are really wonderful, and I completely agree with you, Sarah. Reading these stories, it really helps you to begin to understand student experiences and people's experiences, and the effect that those experiences could have on a life and a family as well. Yeah. Stories empathize. Yeah, we have such different lives and different times. We are a storytelling species. Yes, I completely agree with that as well.
And then Sumangala had said it will destroy family life and person's emotion and physical development and pride. And I think it's through storytelling that you see those impacts, right? That you really, I think that we all know that those are the impacts, but to actually hear someone talk about it and how it has not only impacted perhaps their parents or their grandparents, but themselves and their grandchildren, and how it's generational. And we can really start to understand those, not just a one instance impact, but how that is systemic then, and it really feeds across a whole generations in that sense.
Yes, yeah, I completely agree. It's understanding the experiences and understanding the legacy of the experiences as well, and you know, where we are today in society, definitely.
No, if at any time anyone wants to have these points and say them in their own voice, and not, you're welcome to unmute or raise your hand, any of the functions, and as well as ask Dominique questions. We're in the sort of discussion time, so I'm sure she's free for that as well. But so it just doesn't have to be us speaking. We welcome you guys to pipe in with your own thoughts here.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, children lost their identity and their origin. That's very true as well. And the next question that I have, and I'm going to come back to this word compelled, which I feel is a very important word in our discussion, because we're talking about you know, if children were or were not compelled to attend a school, and you know, is that grounds for whether this school is recognized in the settlement agreement or not. And again, maybe this is something that teachers can also discuss with students a little bit later, but what does the word compelled mean to you? So when I first hear the word compelled, you know, immediately I think of the word forced, you know, but what does forced mean? Is it physical force? Is it, you know, is it law forced? So I'm just kind of wondering what the word compelled means to different people.
Drawn to, and I think to forced, it was in two of your stories, it was the social force, and that what were the other economic or options that were available, or options in terms of social structures that were there.
Yes, exactly. And I'm thank you so much for everybody's contributions. Compelled, trying to convince someone to do something. I was going to say forced as well. Required, mandated, drawn to. Pressure is another great word. So we think about, you know, does force mean, or sorry, does compelled mean by physical or administrative force? There was no means to life except to abide by the federal government. Yeah, so we're looking at, what does the word compelled mean? Is it physical or administrative, or could it extend to the lack of options or the community's control over their education? Both. Yeah. So I think that this is the debate, or the kind of dialogue that we can have about, you know, when we think about how we define the word compelled, and how that kind of impacts how, if schools were sorry, I'm trying to think of the word, if schools were accepted is the wrong word, but were recognized in the settlement agreement. Pressure on family to compel children to attend from law or church, definitely. Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody, for your answers. This is really wonderful how much participation there is. The last 2 points I'll bring up, but I feel like they're a little bit too maybe complex for us to discuss right now, but I did want to bring them up because we're thinking about the 3 stories that we heard. So Claire, who, you know, is, you know, has passed away, but who had, whose research showed that she had a good experience. We have Mike Durache, who again was not compelled to attend, but what other option did he have if Métis children were not able to attend provincial schools? And then Leah Idlout, who, you know, again had to travel far to a hospital school. And these next 2 really touch on more Claire's story. But if a former student feels they had a good experience at a residential school and were not compelled by physical or administrative force to attend, is it any less reason to acknowledge the losses those students experienced by no fault of their own, such as the loss of their language and culture, and compensate for them for it? And lastly, should the fact that a survivor is no longer alive have any bearing on whether their experiences are valid, and should their experiences not also be acknowledged? And that, again, I think that those are maybe too big of questions that we can talk about right now. Compensation does not have a meaning at all. Yeah. And that last point kind of brings me back to what you were saying, Sarah. So if we're thinking about the long-term effects of residential schools, would the fact that somebody is no longer living, should that have any bearing on whether their experiences are acknowledged or not? Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Those
So,
are very, yeah, they're complex questions, right? And I
yeah.
mean, some of them seem, for me, have a very immediately knee-jerk reaction, but I can imagine that within our current discussions around reconciliation, that a lot of these are still like the public sort of is coming to understand the answers to those in very different ways and at different times and with different support. And so what I assume that, the conversations we have now, 10 or 5 or 2 years from now will seem like, well, why weren't we there yet? Or,
Yeah.
and so I think that we are all in the process of learning and encountering new ideas and at different stages. And so it's hard for, I'm sure in some classrooms, there'll be some people who think one thing and other people who think another, and we're all on a journey to our understanding of reconciliation. And so we have to acknowledge that we're coming from different places, and it's not a start and a stop. It's a continual process where even I assume 20 years from now, I will have much more enriched and deepened understandings of the reconciliation. So I want to also acknowledge that we're all in different places on this conversation and journey, and that it's not a stopping point, right?
Yes,
And
I 100% agree. I feel like these are types of questions that can be asked year after year and again and again. And there can be continual discussion as we learn more and we gain our own experiences and we learn from others' experiences as well.
and I really
Yeah.
love this comment by Sumangala. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Is that, what does compensation even mean? So that we've in our system, we've now attached compensation to the conversation of reconciliation through our legal system, and not that compensation isn't something that is necessary, but how does it contribute and how does it distract from the process of reconciliation? I think that in itself is another huge question, right? And do we attach meaning to compensation, or is that, anyways? I just really loved that was like a very big thought bubble for me. It came out of reading that. So I would love at this point, if you don't mind taking down the slides, I would love for us to be able to see you and maybe feature a couple of questions from different students or schools. You can either type it in the chat if you're feeling a little nervous about having your face on camera, or you could stay with your camera off and just unmute. We would love at this point, though, to ask any questions that you have, Dominique, in these last couple of minutes before we sign up. I'd also like to acknowledge that I see our friend Isabel joined us from the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, and she missed my lovely introduction earlier, but I wanted to acknowledge that I see you here in the room, and thank you for joining us today and partnering us on this very important and awesome conversation we've been having so far. All right.
And I would just, and I would like to make a quick comment because the discussions was so exciting. So I'm apologies that I'm late. I'm doing an online Indigenous land-based education training today. So I'm like full up, but we actually worked with Charlene Barehead from also Canadian Geographic, and she just published this beautiful article for us on reconciliation and global citizenship education. And I'd love to share it with you, and I'll share it with you in the chat. But just a quote from it, she says, the younger we start reconciliation education, the more certain our success in equipping learners and with the knowledge, values, and capacities required to live together in peaceful, respectful coexistence. So anyways, just your topic about the questions and the comments that were coming up from the chat about reconciliation, we need to start young, even at a very early age. So I'm so excited to see all the classrooms engaged in this conversation of listening to these important and hard stories, and how that can impact then our generation and the future generations and how we coexist. So thank you for participating.
Thanks, Isabel. So I don't see any hands coming up just yet. I know it can be intimidating, especially on a topic where or sometimes we feel like we don't have the right language. And so we might not want to ask a question that we think might be taken the wrong way, or might be felt as a criticism or a challenge. And anyways, I completely understand. So you're welcome to type it in the chat and we'll get to those, or you're welcome to hold on to them and ask your teacher in a way that, because I know you have a lot of trust with your teachers in that community. And this is a different sort of community with different schools and different students. And so that's okay as well. But we did want to give the opportunity. Now, if you want to unmute, you're welcome to leave it in the chat. Isabel has—
Sarah, I think somebody, Erin Mays, might have their hand up.
She raised her hand. I see the little notice. Did I, Dominique? Over to you, Erin.
Yeah, hi, Sarah. Thanks, Dominique. This has been quite a great presentation. As you can see, I have a number of students from our school who are actually participating. My school is the Bishop Strawn School, so BSS would be our students. And I think I'm asking a question on behalf of the students right now, as we are looking at an extended Truth and Reconciliation Week, and at the end of September, our students will be thinking about ways that they can lead or champion some educational events for our whole school community. And I was wondering, as I'm sure they're wondering, what types of educational activities or directions or topics should we be focusing on as part of this initiative? Any suggestions are welcome. It'll be the first year that we've done anything this big. And so we would like to do the topic justice, but also do so from a very sensitive and informed position.
That's that. I mean, that's first. I'll say that it's wonderful that you're spearheading this this initiative in your school. I think it sounds like such an important thing, and one I hope that a lot of schools will also implement into their yearly weeks and everything. In terms of I feel like it's such a vast topic. It can be hard to narrow down. I know that learning about residential schools is obviously extremely important. So any type of story share, like appropriate story sharing, or inviting elders or people to talk about their experiences, if that's appropriate, is always a great starting point. I know, Sarah, when we talk about the power of storytelling as well, I think that's a great point, a great place to start. Sarah or Isabel, I don't know if you have any follow-up or opinions or suggestions, I should say.
I was just going to say, we're actually partnering up with the National Center of Truth and Reconciliation, and I just shared the link in the chat for Reconciliation Week. So that's such a great initiative. And they're also launching a project called Imagine a Canada, and that's really inviting schools to reflect on what would a reconciled Canada look like. So for younger age groups, that can look like a reflection piece using art and drawing and whatnot. For older kids, it can be a reconciliation project. So to actually build relations with nations close to your school, understanding the physical land that you're on, the history of it, really, and just to say what Dominic was saying, like the history part is very important. So to know where we are today. So I think there's so many different examples, and Charlene, in the article that I shared, actually, she strongly recommends also Projects of Heart, which was led by a teacher and has great ideas, and it's teacher peer supported about some ideas about what you can do in the classroom. But so excited to hear that, and excited to see how that'll unfold in the fall, to hopefully see students learning from others across the country.
Thank you so much. Those are some excellent jumping off points for us.
Wonderful. Well, we have come to, I see that some schools have already had to jump off because it's the top of the hour. And so I wanted to say thank you very much to all of our wonderful schools that joined today from across the country and those who will be watching on YouTube. Thanks to Dominique for joining us from CanGeo, the short, cool form of Canadian Geographic Education, which is a part of the Royal Canadian, is it Geographic Society? I'm sorry, I've just
no, there's so many acronyms and so many. Yes, you
so many
have it right.
acronyms.
The Royal Canadian Geographical Society.
And then, of course, to our wonderful partners at Canadian Commission for UNESCO, who are always so generous in coming alongside these important conversations that we're having, thinking about, what is reconciliation? What does it mean to have that as a part of citizenship, to have that as a part of our, not just things that we do in school or hear about in the workplace or see on TV, but what does it mean to me? And how do I embed these conversations into my life and my family? And so thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. We very much look forward to having you at events in the future. And good luck with the remaining school year. We're almost there. We're almost there. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.